Um, Today's topic is kind of where does crypto fit in the world? And then toward the back end of it, we're going to start getting into um, probably some of the more things as you start maybe considering an investment in crypto, things that you'll be looking at, and that will certainly be the focus of the final session on Thursday. So before we get started, I think we have a relatively small group here, at least at the beginning today. I'll start with a question, and because there's a small group, feel free to unmute. But anybody have a guess at which country in the world has the highest per capita penetration of cryptocurrency? In other words, the highest percentage of the population using cryptocurrency.
Russia?
China?
Venezuela?
Good guesses so far. Not quite there.
Bermuda?
India.
India? No. No, it was illegal in India till very recently, although it doesn't mean people weren't doing it.
That was a trick question then, Bob.
Argentina?
No, but that's up there. That's a top 5.
I'm thinking really, really hyperinflated currency.
All right, I'm going to guess the United States.
No.
That was the best.
South Korea?
No. So the Argentina guess is on the right vein, but we'll skip to the next slide and
Those are fine.
and show you. So number 1 in the world is Turkey, and if you look at this chart here, top 5: Turkey, Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, South Africa. Now look at the bottom 5: Japan, Germany, France, US, UK. So one of the things that you can kind of surmise from this in general is that political stability, at least perceived political stability and perceived financial stability, is directly related to the penetration, or actually because the inversely related. So countries like Turkey, which is in a very turbulent part of the world, the lira's had a lot of issues. There's a lot going on there between the Kurds and Syria and all the immigrants and all that. When you have places like Argentina, that I believe that may have been James that mentioned Argentina, a place where the currency has collapsed multiple times. You see those sort of countries, and you can clearly see this relationship. I had before the coronavirus thing, I had an opportunity to have a meeting with a guy named Dr. Chris Wesley, who's the dean of the School of Business at Florida Gulf Coast University, and we've talked about maybe doing a little more detailed research on this to hone in on these numbers. Now, by the way, somebody had thrown out Venezuela, which was, I think, an excellent guess, and they may well be number 1. They just don't have the ability to get the data. So I'll qualify that. I'll actually probably give that an actual yes vote after I've shown you the slide, because that'd be my guess as well, is that if it was possible to get a true sample size, Venezuela would be number 1. So the point I'm trying to show here is that when you think about cryptocurrency, one of the most important things I think you can do is separate yourself from being a person in a privileged position in a first world country, in a first world economy. And you can see here, when you have roughly 1 in every 5 adults in Turkey who owns cryptocurrency or has at least used cryptocurrency, you start thinking, why is that? We'll kind of bore into that in a little more detail here. Now, one of the things about Bitcoin, and you could say the same thing for Ethereum. You could say the same thing for Monero, and a couple of the other major cryptocurrencies. By the way, you cannot say this for Ripple. You cannot say this for instance, Bitcoin SV. There are some others which we'll get into a lot more in the next session. But there are these elements here of a decentralized platform, which we've explained a lot about that last time, but nobody owns it. Nobody turns it on or off. There is no way to discriminate a transaction from one person to another, from one transaction to another, one person to another. So there's no good old boys club. There's no way to kind of circumvent the system. And everything is transparent. Even if somebody were trying to do that, it would become instantly apparent that there was an issue in the system and that something wasn't going right because of that transparency. The immutability of the ledger, I think, is something I probably didn't stress enough in the last one, which is, if you remember the way those ledgers were created and the way the blockchain came together, that you can't go back. There is no way to undo a transaction other than to get the other party to decide to agree to send money back, or under legal recourse. There's not a way for the financial system to do that. So Harper asked, do you believe Ripple will be heavily used by central banks when they want to incorporate a digital currency? I believe that Ripple has an excellent chance in the short term of being what I would call a gateway drug for cryptocurrency, and that not so much the central governments or the central banks utilizing it, but I think the big financial institutions will heavily use it, and they might drag some central banks with it. So if you have Deutsche Bank and Bank of America and Bank of Japan, and you have some of these big organizations, and they start trying to move money in the cryptocurrency world, I think they will use Ripple. That's the most likely scenario in the short term. So, and then the fourth kind of key element, and so I believe Bitcoin is a sovereign economy. In other words, if you become part of the Bitcoin network, if you purchase Bitcoin, you hold Bitcoin, you are in a sense a member of a economic country that is sovereign in and of itself, and it doesn't recognize other borders. Now, today, if you look at foreign exchange, every day about $6.5 trillion, it's really a mind-blowing number, moves every day from country to country in foreign exchange situations. If you add this chart up, and I don't have the smaller ones down there, you'll see that it adds up to exactly 200%, because every foreign exchange transaction obviously involves two currencies, right? So, but 90% of the time, the dollar is on one side of that transaction or the other. So I'm rounding up, but roughly 6 trillion of the dollars sit there, and that's a big piece of the demand for the dollar, and the strength of the dollar comes because it is the settlement mechanism for most of the world's foreign exchange. And the petrodollar is a big piece of that. An interesting sidebar, because so much of this is petrol related, that at least recently, the crash in petrol pricing, I saw today that oil dropped under $20 a barrel. That in essence reduces the demand for the dollar. So now the dollar is still very strong relative to pretty much every other currency through the results of the last couple weeks. But where that falls when all this money actually gets printed and kind of this whole thing settles up and we see what all these other economies have done. I'm not sure anybody really knows for sure, but I think most people have a fairly pessimistic view of what that means. So another little interactive thing here. I'm only putting up part of this slide here. You can see this headline here. It says Iran issues 1,000 crypto mining licenses. Anybody have a guess as to what's going on there? Why would they do that?
Only allows the elite to get in.
It sidesteps the trade sanctions put on them.
Yes, exactly. So what's happening in the world right now is that I'll refer to them as the bad actors, at least as so deemed by most of the world. Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, you see some others on this list too. They have interestingly moved very heavily toward cryptocurrency. So a deeper dive into what Iran has done. So Iran, the sanctions are such that they can't get their hands on dollars right now. So at least in certain circles, people are willing to accept cryptocurrency. And so they have put a massive effort into getting as much cryptocurrency as they can. There's no way for either the Bitcoin network or the Ethereum network or several others that are mining related to monitor and mitigate the flow of the mined currency into a given location. So what Iran has done is very interesting. Is they went out and they said, hey, we're going to issue 1,000 cryptocurrency mining licenses. And let's just say Tanner wanted to be one of those people. So he'd go down to the office, he'd literally get a cryptocurrency mining license. And with that license, he would acquire the right to buy highly subsidized electricity from the Iranian government. And electricity would be his number one cost of doing business in mining. After the initial capital expenses, operating costs are all based on electricity. So he would essentially get free electricity for doing this. The caveat is that the government is overseeing wallet and mandating that wallet, the proceeds of that wallet on a regular basis be sold to the Iranian government into their local currency. So what Iran is doing is into their central reserves, they're acquiring a whole bunch of Bitcoin and Ethereum, which they can then go into international marketplaces and acquire goods and services that they would not otherwise be able to do. North Korea has tried to do this as well. They also are probably the number one hacking organization trying to steal cryptocurrency from people. They've had some success hacking some exchanges. So they're trying to do that. There's an American actually who was arrested recently because they held a cryptocurrency conference in North Korea, and for some reason this guy went there and spoke and was perceived as basically helping the enemy, and he's in prison now. Venezuela has moved hard toward cryptocurrency in multiple ways. One, they're trying to sell oil and other precious resources, gold and diamonds and silver, on the open market for primarily Bitcoin. They put the equivalent of $250 million of oil on the market, and mandated payment in Bitcoin. they've created their own cryptocurrency called the Petro, which my understanding, and it's all anecdotal, is that they're issuing payments for state contracts. So if you're in Venezuela and you're building bridges or repairing roads or providing meals to the military, whatever, that you're getting paid in petrol. And so that is supposed to be a gold standard like cryptocurrency managed by the Venezuelan government. But my understanding is that everybody that acquires it quickly exchanges it for Bitcoin and moves on. I will say I use the word cryptocurrency loosely because I don't believe it really is a cryptocurrency. We'll talk about those definitions later. Mainly that I think if a cryptocurrency is centrally managed, and like it is in this case, then it by definition in my book is not a cryptocurrency. It's more of a digital currency. But anyway, this is a very important point. I'm not saying whether this is good or bad, and we're going to talk about this before. The usages of cryptocurrency, just like the usages of the US dollar, are going to be for things we like and things we don't like. Regardless, what we're seeing is that in certain sections of the world, at the central government level, the acquisition of cryptocurrency is becoming a highly desirable thing. And that's good for demand, and it's good for the propagation of the cryptocurrency. It may present other problems, like in the short term, it may keep some of these people in power. In the long term, I think it's actually bad for them, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Another thing that's very interesting is if we look at all the dark markets in the world, and I wasn't even familiar with some of these terms, by the way, until a year and a half ago when I started doing more speaking on this and more research. But the dark markets are basically everything that's not the white market. So the white market is, kind of what most of us do. We go to a job, we get a paycheck, we get a W-2 generated. From that, we make investments in legal businesses, we go buy potato chips, all those sort of things, and normal transparency and taxation applies. Gray market is kind of a mix of things that are maybe kind of bad and maybe not so bad. It can be as simple as $20 that you gave a neighborhood kid to mow your lawn, which is, technically a market activity. It could be the employing a maid illegally who is not in the country legally. And by the way, this is not just the US, this is global. Gambling, prostitution, those sort of things all fit in the gray world. In the black market, then you have more of the like we're talking about drugs. This is more the El Chapos and the Pablo Escobar class stuff going on there. Weapons sales, and then down below, the red market, which those of you who followed like Silk Road and all that, and there's still this stuff going on today on the dark web, where killers for hire and buying organs and some really not good stuff. And then of course all of the Nigerian, your uncle died and you've inherited all this money, you just need to give me all your bank account information, and some bank in Nigeria is going to send you all this money. That sort of stuff sits there. So anyway, defining that, it's mind-boggling how big the non-white markets are. 16 to 20 trillion dollars globally. Roughly 20% of all of the world's economic activity sits in these buckets, and 2 billion people, roughly approaching half of the world's workforce, exists in these areas. Well, what's happening in these areas is that to the degree they can, those markets are moving to the dark net, and the amount of commerce transacted through the dark net is starting to go very, very high. This is per quarter. And so this would have been Q4 of 2019. So we had about $600 million in Bitcoin, just in basically transactions that research has been able to categorize as highly likely to have occurred on the darknet. What's interesting is that when you examine the details of a lot of the different coins, Monero is really considered the kind of the number one privacy coin. So if you're really concerned about anonymity to the nth degree, it's probably the best coin. But Bitcoin is still dominant in this marketplace, and because there are ways of kind of washing Bitcoin and making it quite difficult to trace. But I bring this up because if this market here, and this here, if they continue the direction that they're moving, they bring just a phenomenal use case and demand for cryptocurrency, and most likely Bitcoin, by the way, maybe to a lesser degree Monero, that should drive price up. Now, again, I guess I didn't say it, but no, I'm not giving financial advice. I'm not giving you a specific price target. I'm not trying to say go buy anything, but when I look at this, my opinion, these alone are almost certain paths for continuing growth of cryptocurrency behind all those things that I believe that can happen in the white market, which of course is the other 80% of the world economy. Now, part of that, I want to kind of talk about the kind of rest of the world here a little bit. Africa and the lesser economies of the world still represent massive amounts of opportunity. So I think I gave this stat last year, but as of the last World Bank report, roughly 1.7 billion adults in the world do not have a bank account. There's another similar number, it's a billion-ish sort of number, of what's called underbanked, which means somebody may have an account where they can deposit money, but they are kind of outside of the credit system, so they don't have a chance to get a loan and like those sort of things. So the banking system to them is a tiny little thing, and it would so they have this term underbanked as opposed to unbanked. There's a lot of speculation that, especially if we look at a place like Africa, that the banks will never come, that the amount of time it will take in a lot of these lesser developed countries for a reliable banking system to appear, it's almost an insurmountable hurdle. But these people, as soon as they're connected to the internet, in which they are getting connected at a massive rate, they have smartphones, they're getting connected to high-speed bandwidth, and the belief is that they will leapfrog and that they will go from being unbanked to having access to the cryptocurrency financial infrastructure, which connects them to the whole world and treats them no different than some guy in Birmingham, Alabama. It doesn't actually know the difference between them. So if they acquire cryptocurrency, they have the ability to move it and do commerce with anybody anywhere in the world. They have the right to lend that money to other people. They have an opportunity to plug into the borrowing infrastructure that exists in cryptocurrency. And so that this is by some people, when they look at cryptocurrency, they say, this is a true way to start leveling the world and bringing people, out of these deprived and poverty, no hope sort of situations. I believe that very strongly. So we got a chat question here, Harper. How would you see the third world countries remember their private key? Most don't have a phone or a safe place to keep the private key. Well, okay, a couple different things there. The first is they actually are having phones, and that will be an enabling point. But we're seeing, for instance, in India last year, about 500 million people went from not having any internet to having the equivalent of a 4 to 5G connection. And the penetration of cell phones, and they can get a cell phone with reasonable capabilities now for the equivalent of $100 or less, which is still a lot of money to a lot of them, but it's not completely inaccessible. As for a safe place to store their private key, my guess is in the short term they won't use a private key, that they will use custodial services. For instance, in Africa, there's a really cool company called Paxful, Paxful, that is doing wonderful things to bring these kind of services to especially people in Africa. So I think they'll in the short term they'll use custodial services and not store private keys individually. Now in the long run, that's not a great thing, but for right now, it would at least get them over the hump. On the right side of the screen here, there's a term called diaspora, and the diaspora essentially means people that have left their home country. So my wife would be an example. My wife's originally from the Philippines, grew up there. She actually left to go to Korea and then to Macau before we were married, and now she's in the US. But we frequently send money back to the home country to help people there, family members or friends that have issues. And that's very true in Mexico. It's very true in India. Many cultures have this sort of belief, like in the Philippines, because my knowledge of it is highest. People go to great lengths to do everything possible to get their kid into college, and Filipino nurses are scattered all over the world. And the reason that happens is the family will put everything it has. If it has 4 kids, it'll put everything it has to get that first kid into college and through college, and to pass a board exam from some country, and off they go, whether that's to the US, to Saudi Arabia, to New Zealand, to wherever. And then it becomes the burden of that person to essentially live a sustenance lifestyle in wherever they've ended up, and get as much money back to the family as possible, and both to help them live and also maybe to bring the siblings through the same system. And that happens everywhere. So in Africa, for instance, Nigeria, in 2017, it was the most recent data I could get, sent 22 billion back to the country for this. Now, I think I gave you some numbers last week. I told you about this $1,550 transaction that we sent to the Philippines, and it cost us $61, about 4%. That's actually on the lower side of what stuff costs. We've sent as little as 200 and had $150 show up on the other end at 25%. So if you start applying those sort of numbers which are going to the Western unions and those sort of services, what you're seeing is these essentially these poor people who that money would mean a tremendous amount to, not seeing a lot of that money. Cryptocurrency just breaks that down completely, and it allows the money to get there more quickly and more cheaply, which means more money is coming into the little economy, and the standard of living goes up. So in countries like this, it's just absolutely critical. Now, we'll kind of shift here a little bit. I wanted to talk about, you know, what was going on in that second and third world. Now we're going to shift a little bit to a little more first world stuff. Don't have time to go into this, but we could probably spend a week talking about this chart alone. So we're just going to talk about transactability here, which is kind of right in the middle. And I bring it up because it's probably the number one reason people who are cryptocurrency detractors fight against it. For instance, Peter Schiff, who is he's a big gold guy. I respect him somewhat as an economist, but he hates Bitcoin. And one of the things he'll say is there's no use for it. And I'll tweet back to him. Usually doesn't respond to me, but I'll tweet back to him and say, well, I just used it this week. I don't know how you can say that it has no purpose, because as we just saw in the previous thing, I'm moving money from me to other people in the world faster and more cheaply, and I'm also getting orders from customers that we're processing, that we're saving money and making our business run faster because of it. But it's still a little harder to use than, let's say, a bank wire. You know, people don't accept it. But for instance, relative to gold is really terrible as a transaction engine. Its primary use is as a store of value, which again is a whole different thing we could talk about. Bitcoin is attempting to be both. Bitcoin and most cryptocurrencies want to be both a store of value as well as a medium of exchange. Now, the problem for a place like Bitcoin is that right now, this is the kind of some of the main credit card processors in the world. We have Visa, MasterCard, and PayPal. Pick those three. They have these massive data centers. They're scattered all over the world. If a tsunami, I think I use this example. If a tsunami hits the eastern seaboard right now, they have enough data centers, all of them do, that there would be some problems, but they would be up and running and be able to transact pretty quickly. Visa, for instance, right now could simultaneously handle about 65,000 transactions per second. If you remember my chart from last week on blocks in Bitcoin, Bitcoin can do about 2,800 transactions every 10 minutes. So clearly, if every Starbucks transaction or Subway transaction was trying to occur within the Bitcoin network right now, it would get overwhelmed. And so, that's a problem. And by the way, just an interesting stat, I found this fascinating as I was doing some research. 5.3 billion credit cards in the world. There's just under 7.8 billion people in the world. So there's about 2/3 of a credit card for every person in the world. Now, this is there's a guy named Vitalik Buterin, and Vitalik is the kind of the technical brainchild behind Ethereum. He's really kind of a different sort of cat. I really like him. I think he's brilliant. He's a young guy. He's only 26 years old. Great mathematical mind, out-of-box thinker. Not everybody likes Vitalik, but I think he's been very good for cryptocurrency, and what he's trying to do with Ethereum is great. But Vitalik has come up with what he called the trilennium, or trilemma, excuse me, the trilemma. And what he said was, when you're developing a cryptocurrency, there are um, there are three potential things that you can have at the core of your cryptocurrency, but you can only have two of them at a time. In other words, you could be scalable, meaning you could be really big and really fast, and decentralized, but then you would not be very secure. If you're secure and decentralized, then you can't be very fast. And I wouldn't be surprised if 20 years from now, when they're writing cryptocurrency textbooks and this is part of economic programs, they talk about this, that this is probably some sort of a cryptocurrency law. So in the case of Bitcoin, it is decentralized and secure. It's not very scalable. So there is a way around it, though, and that's by creating what's called another layer. So basically, it's maybe to a certain degree, this is not a great analogy, but it's the best one I come up with. It's kind of like if at the bottom layer you have a central bank, like the government bank, and at the next layer you have maybe a local and regional banks, right? So the central bank would not be very good at if we all had to go deposit our the $25 we got from grandma for our birthday into the central bank, probably not going to work very well, right? So there are certain things that can happen at that level versus certain things that maybe are better at the local level, and it's the same way with Bitcoin. So the second layer, there's three different kind of things going on in the second layer. So one is transaction engines, and Lightning is the one that is being built to help with microtransactions. So the idea, very simply, the idea is you take some money out of your Bitcoin wallet and you transfer it into a Lightning wallet. So let's just say hypothetically you had 30 Bitcoin, which is a lot of money, in your main Bitcoin wallet, and you take a tenth of a Bitcoin, which right now would be about $600, and you put it in a Lightning wallet. Okay. Now, what are you giving up? You in this case, you're giving up a decentralized platform. Okay, but not with very much money. And then this Lightning network is built such that it can mimic those same things that the credit cards can do, and it can process thousands of transactions per second. And so that project is in beta right now. In the middle of the exchanges, this is where the exchanges sit. So if you go out to Coinbase and you buy one Bitcoin, if you leave it in Coinbase, technically, at the lower level down here, Bitcoin thinks Coinbase owns that. You have a separate contract between you and Coinbase that gives you the right to one Bitcoin here. But if Coinbase were to go out of business, well, then you have a problem. Or Coinbase were to be hacked somehow, that would create a problem. Sometimes tokens, and I'll explain what a token is in a little bit here. Sometimes tokens also exist here. So anyway, this is kind of the solution to that problem. Bitcoin and Ethereum are what they are, and their focus is here. And so sitting on top of them will be these other solutions that provide these other services that primarily sit on the scalability issue with Bitcoin. Okay, so I'm going to move along here. So if we look at maybe a chart here, what you'll see is that different types of transactions have different time windows in which they must occur. And so right now, you'll see that these microtransactions, which pretty much means what occurs in our daily life today, a trip to Target, a Happy Meal from McDonald's, a gallon of gas, those are occurring right here. And those things have to occur sub 1 second. By the time that transaction gets presented to the network, it has to process, say yes or no, and move on. You know, cryptocurrency right now is 10 minutes, so it's not really practical for you using Bitcoin in its pure form that way. But that will change as these other solutions get added on top, in this case, Lightning. We'll see that in certain places, like remittance, like the example I gave before, the traditional system is really hours or even days at very high fees. And crypto is already in minutes, and it will be sub-seconds here. So, you know, you also, so when we evaluate things, a lot of the traditional people coming from the traditional finance, they tend to criticize cryptocurrency based on what it can do now without really having a good understanding of where it's going. But my belief is that over the course of the next 3.5 years, this is what you're going to see. And if you look at that, you'll see that cryptocurrency becomes a legitimate threat pretty much across the board on any of these transaction types. Now, another chart I created, by the way, that previous chart is me in my opinion. This chart also me in my opinion. This is how I carved up the world. You'd carve it up your own way. But what I since we started today kind of talking about the bad actors out there, you know, right now they love it. But let's say at some point they acquire it so much and become so dependent on cryptocurrency, and they can't stop the people within their country from using it, which I think will happen, by the way. I think it's already happened in Venezuela. They're going to learn to hate it, because they like Iran right now in that situation I gave you, they're saying, okay, you guys give us all this Bitcoin, we're going to make you give it to us when you mine it, and then we're going to go spend it, and we're going to give you back this local currency. But the people are going to value less and less that local currency, and they're going to start saying, no, we don't want that, we're not going to use it, or they're going to start acquiring these cryptocurrencies on their own. And at that point, they lose control. Now, if we look at third world governments, and I gave some examples of types of countries that right now they're kind of fighting it a little bit, because it's disruptive to their local economies in the first place. These are countries that they don't have sanctions against them, so the government doesn't need it. The government is used to using dollars. It's used to having a local currency that it controls. But it also is slave to the US dollar and slave to US policies and those sort of things. And I think ultimately, again, this is just the Bob Burnett prediction, is that we're going to see countries of this size, and maybe this size in here too, realize that if they band together and use a common cryptocurrency, or cryptocurrencies, even if it's a couple of them, that are completely separated from the financial control of the US government and the big banking system, that they're going to realize that that's a much more powerful position than where they sit today, and that they're going to love it. And that if let's say the bottom 80 or so, 80 to 100 countries in the world in GDP move to this as a currency, either entirely or partially, that they then collectively gain a lot of power and a lot of flexibility. Now, China and Russia, they both love it and hate it now, and I think they're going to continue to love it and hate it, because it's going to fight against their local currency, but it also is a phenomenal weapon in unseating the US as the global currency, the US dollar as the global currency. So I think you'll see kind of this love-hate relationship with cryptocurrency from all of these governments. For the most part, what I called the power governments here, and again, these are just examples, and there's lines like, hey, is the UK, is it a developed smaller government or power government? I'm not sure where that line is. They're somewhat neutral on it right now, and but I think in the end they're going to hate it, especially the US. I think ultimately will hate it, but I believe it's too far gone already, and their ability to control it and stop it is too strong. Now, will it replace the US dollar as the global reserve currency? I don't know, but it's certainly going to hurt it. I'm very confident in that. Now, outside of the governments, we have, the banks. And as I said, the big banks, for the most part, have put a face on of hating it. In the long run, I think they'll realize that they still, if they embrace it to a certain degree, which I think they will, I think they'll all find a way to incorporate it into their infrastructure, and they'll at least be quasi-neutral about it. The ones I'm really worried about are the small regional banks, though. I think they're in trouble, and they don't have any clue what's coming, because there are going to be so many other options and ways around them, and the services they provide, and kind of the bloated prices that they charge. And I think they're really going to get hurt by this. Maybe the analogy would be how the local video stores got put out of business by Blockbuster and then Netflix. Now, the big financial services companies, the JP Morgans of the world and Fidelity and those sort of places, they already kind of like it. Now, if I had done this chart 2 years ago, I would have said they hated it, but they've already warmed it. They've all made reasonable investments in cryptocurrency, especially custodial services already. And I think they're going to love it. It's a whole new asset class. They're going to have a whole new set of services that they can offer and provide, and most likely open up markets on a global basis. This is where they're not going to go around laws. Clearly, they're going to abide by the governments, but I think there's going to be ways in which it opens up global markets to them even better and gives them access to markets like Africa, for instance. I think they'll find a way to tie into the wealth of Africa very well. Okay, a couple more slides. Okay, when the word cryptocurrency often gets used a little too generically. Cryptocurrency is a currency that should have these three attributes, or at least two of them strongly: a medium of exchange, and a store of value, and a unit of account. Bitcoin fits this well. Ethereum fits this well. I would add the decentralized component to it, which is why I would exclude something like Ripple from actually calling it a cryptocurrency. A utility token, the simplest way for me to describe a utility token is this way. We've all been to the carnival or the amusement park, and when you go there, you know how they will say, hey, you want to go on the Ferris wheel. You never can hand $5 to the Ferris wheel guy, right? You go to some booth and you give them $5, and they give you a bunch of these tickets. And those tickets are the equivalent of a utility token. So Ethereum, especially, one of the great uses of Ethereum is that because of the power of the smart contract, which we talked about in the last session, people are able to take on the second layer. If you go back to that slide, that second layer, they're able to make the equivalent of the Carnival token up there and say to people, okay, you take Ethereum, you put it in this token. We'll give you in exchange some other token, which you can then use for a specific good or service, and that could be access to a website. It could be access to a music service. It could be access or partial ownership in a property or a piece of art, those sort of things. Now, there's also a security token, and a security token or security. A lot of people went out and they did what are called ICOs, initial coin offerings. It's very popular in 2017 and 2018, and this is one of those cases where the law couldn't keep up with the pace of technology. So people went out and said, hey, I have an idea for something new in the cryptocurrency world. And so I'm going to offer this token. And you would, in reality, what you're doing is you're buying a share of company stock, and you're funding this company at a seed level. And in exchange, you get this token. And what you're hoping is that whatever it is that company was trying to go after, will rise in value, much like a stock would. Well, a lot of companies kind of got around the qualified investor rules. A lot of companies didn't have the right sort of filings and prospectus. The SEC really cracked down on this. So these still occur, but not in very great numbers. And a lot of the ones that went out in like 2017 went belly up. And it created a lot of what was called the altcoin craze. And the ICO craze, and a lot of them honestly were scams, and people just got caught up and lost a lot of money. This is an example of a token, and I'll just do it real quickly because I'm running kind of long here. There was a building in Switzerland, in Zurich, and this is the actual property. I don't know that city. So, but I'm told it's a very prominent area of the city. And so what they did, in essence, was the owner of the building, somebody bought the building and then tokenized the building, just as I described before, so that each token became a portion ownership in that building. And the tokens could then be bought and sold at a very small basis. So it's kind of a way of quickly doing a REIT and doing it at a really, really small level if you wanted. They also were trying to do things like have tenants use these coins to pay rent and try to create a little ecosystem within this community. So I'm gonna close and my portion of the presentation, and we can do questions. Next week we're going to talk a lot about a lot of charts. I'll have a lot of numbers for you. We'll have a lot more analysis. But I'm going to leave you with this one, and we'll probably start next week with an updated, or on Thursday, an updated version of this. But there is a crypto fear greed index, and it's at almost its all-time low right now. Since the coronavirus thing happened, there was just a massive downturn in optimism right now. And I have no idea what the same chart would look like for equities or for bonds or for gold or whatever, but I can say that in cryptocurrency right now, we're in at least recent history pretty much as fearful as it can be. Pricing, amazingly though, has from this, if we charted this, there was a massive drop. If we look at Bitcoin went from 8,000 to 3,800 right here. It's back up around 7,000. So it's interesting how the price has recovered not all the way, but some of the way from where it was here. So again, I'm not telling anybody what to do or when to do it or whatever, but I will say I have been buying a little bit myself, and this quote from Warren Buffett, in his philosophy, we simply attempt to be fearful when others are greedy, and to be greedy when others are fearful. Probably something worth thinking about. So with that, I'll close the presentation portion of tonight's session, and any questions? So if tokens are used to split up ownership, how would dividends be paid out? That would be up to the person developing the tokens. And one way would be through the issuance of new tokens. And that's up to, again, whomever created that token. If not, it probably would not pay out a dividend, but would instead just appreciate like a non-dividend paying stock, and that at the point that the building was sold and the dividends were divided up, it would pay out that way. What else? James asks, how do you believe legal tender laws will affect adoption? Very interesting question. I've got a slide here. Let's see if I can find it quickly. So first, while the definition of legal tender, so legal tender is in the US defined as a currency that can be used for the settlement of debt. And it doesn't, and so the US dollar is legal tender. But interestingly, the Constitution, I've got a slide here, the Constitution itself is actually kind of unclear. And there are some people, I'm not a junkie on this, but I do follow some people who are. There's a lot of people wondering about this because, it says that, right here, basically the Constitution is very little about money. Okay. So, here there's a Coin Act from 1965. It says that coins and currency are legal tender for all debts, public charges, taxes, and dues. In Article 1, Section 10, it says that gold and silver coin should be used in tender for payment of debts. Now, since we don't have the gold standard anymore, there's an argument that Congress didn't have the authority through this act that was overriding the Constitution. So there's a potential for this massive battle. The end of the day, though, outside of settling debt with the government, there's no law that precludes any individual from accepting any form of payment, whether that's cryptocurrency or a basket of rice or apples in the settlement of a debt. It has to be, by tax law, has to be translated back, and any capital gains and losses have to be realized based on whatever happened in that barter. Now, Japan has said it is legal. They've accepted Bitcoin as legal tender. The state of Ohio and the state of Wyoming have now said they will accept cryptocurrency, specifically Bitcoin, for the settlement of tax debt. So there's so there's that movement. Question from Mick: is the U.S. Treasury investing in cryptocurrencies? Very, very interesting question. There are people that believe that they have, but they have not publicly stated that they have, and there have been some seizures. So where different criminals have had cryptocurrency that the government was able to acquire the keys for, and they have auctioned it off, and that's true of most other big governments where they've gotten access to it, as they've auctioned it off. So there's a strong belief that Russia and China both have a lot in their central banks. Harper asks, can't the Fed just purchase the majority of crypto? Yeah, amazingly, they could. The whole cryptocurrency market is about $200 billion right now. So that would just be an afterthought to the money that they're printing right now. Now, we're going to talk about value though. So if you believe, the way that market cap is calculated, it would take about $120 billion to buy all the Bitcoin right now, right? That's the valuation. But we're going to talk about this. I'm going to show you some charts next week. There's about 12 million Bitcoin that hasn't been sold in the last year, and it's held by what are called hodlers, and I would consider myself a hodler, which is somebody who holds Bitcoin and is in it for the long term. Unless I had to, out of necessity of putting a roof over my family's house or feeding my family, I wouldn't sell any of my Bitcoin for. It would take the government probably offering me $100,000 of Bitcoin for me to sell mine, and I think a lot of the hodlers would be the same way. So, what is market cap? Like it's kind of like a hostile acquisition of a company. There's probably some price at which I would give it up, but it's way above the market cap. So the Fed could purchase it all, but they'd have to come up with the money to get it out of everybody's hands, and a lot of the hodlers value it very highly. So what else? What other questions? On the African leapfrog point, in my view, crypto will do to banking in emerging markets what Starlink is doing to fiber optics in these markets. Yes, exactly. In fact, they go a little bit hand in hand, don't they? Yeah. Anyone else? And if anyone wants to just talk, they can too, if they want to type. Tokens for rents. Yes, absolutely. I think, like in that Zurich example, I think that highly likely that they will force their tenants to pay in some sort of token. I would. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody.